that's the issue for us, is the nuisance flooding. Next slide. All right, so that has led us, and we don't have an issue with people wanting to talk about sea level rise or climate change or resilience, because so much of our city and so many of our residents get to experience this nuisance flooding. So there's no doubt in anybody's mind that it's real. But we define resilience in the city as a little different than a lot of people, but it's not just it's not just the shocks. We all know what the shocks are. Those are the big storms that come up the coast, and the hurricanes and the tornadoes and earthquakes and stuff like that. We know, I mean, those are what shocks are. And, you can kind of prepare for those, and we do. But for what we really focus on a lot are the stresses. And those are the things that aren't single events, but are issues that create for us continuing challenges, such as our economy is heavily dependent on a single economic actor, that over the last 20 to 30 years has become a pretty unreliable partner, and that's the federal government. We are also, our economy is threatened by the fact that nearly half of the families who live in the city of Norfolk live below the poverty line. Think about that. Nearly half of the families that live in the city of Norfolk live below the poverty line. That is a stress. Next slide. Our view of resilience is not just the physical challenges that most people think of, but it's also the economic challenges, as well as the social challenges associated with concentrated poverty and that sort of thing. Next slide. So our goals are to survive and thrive in a rising water environment. We've decided that we are going to be the coastal community of the future, and we're going to use that to create economic opportunities and advance initiatives. And one of those initiatives, or several of those initiatives, are involved in planning, and that's where what I'm really going to focus on today. So next slide, please. So we began our resilience journey with something we call Vision 2100, which was this audacious idea that you could actually do a planning project that looked out 100 years. And why did we do that? Well, because sea level rise, we were looking at, somewhere between 2 and 3 meters of sea level rise in 100 years. And that's something that is going to be a challenge for the community, and is going to have some transformative components to it. And so because of that, we decided we needed to do a visioning process to think about where we're going to be. So the thing about sea level rise is it doesn't happen overnight. It's this insidious thing that just kind of, creeps up a little bit here, this month and a little bit next month, and it's ultimately over time it becomes a really big deal, but it does not come in quick and fast increments. So that's the reason we picked it. We also picked the Vision 2100 idea because when you do a planning project that gets that far out, it's a project that, as I said at one of our many public meetings that we had with it, to one of the residents who was probably not real thrilled with what I told him, but I told him, I said, this project isn't about you. And it really isn't for you or me, because we're both going to be dead by the time we get to the planning horizon. This is about our kids, our grandkids, and our great-grandkids. And what's the legacy that we want to leave for them? And so the quintessential question we asked in Vision 2100 is, if you have a city that is subject to sea level rise, and so therefore we have to make some changes, we have to do some adaptations, what are those things, places, people, events that define Norfolk as a unique place? So what is it that makes Norfolk Norfolk? Or put another way, what is it that if it went away, we'd still be a big city by the sea, but we wouldn't be the same as we are today in terms of identity. And so that gave us the opportunity to talk to a lot of people and really sort of get rid of the whole tie to my property, my backyard, my street. And that was that was the goal of why we set it up the way we set it up. And it was a funny story. We were flying back from New York City, the person who's now our zoning administrator and I, and we just designed this whole program in a couple of cramped airplane seats coming back from LaGuardia. So it was where we had met with the Rockefeller Foundation folks, and that was why we were thinking about it. But the idea of figuring out what it is that is important to the community in terms of identity was pretty transformative. So anyway, next slide. The result was we created these 4 areas of the city that are vision areas that tells us a little bit about what we're going to think about. So the colors mean nothing. They just happen to be colors. And so the red areas are areas, quite frankly, that are such huge economic drivers for the city that they have to be protected. So it's downtown, it's the port, it's the naval station, and it's the various shipyards and shipbuilding industries that are in Norfolk and lead across into Portsmouth. The yellow areas of those we sort of refer to as the living with water areas, because in order to protect them, we would have to destroy the thing that makes them special, which is their tie to the water. It's hard to feel like you're tied to the water when you have a 17-foot concrete T-wall between you and the water. And that's the only way to kind of protect some of these areas. So those are the kinds of choices that we've had to talk about making. Purple areas are areas that we really don't see a whole heck of a lot of change, maybe some slight densification, but basically, they can't get to stay pretty much as they are. And the green areas are areas of opportunity. Many of those are higher ground, and they also are areas where there are opportunities for redevelopment. One of those is Military Circle, what is now a totally failed shopping mall, and we have several plans out or proposals in that are being reviewed for a complete and total redevelopment of that area. So that's what we did, and that was Vision 2100. What that led to, next slide please, is the zoning ordinance. And so our strategy for zoning is a whole of government, whole of community approach. It cannot just simply be the city, because these are challenges that are beyond what the city of Norfolk alone can manage and deal with. And so it requires both the state and the federal levels of government, as well as citizens and businesses and everybody on board. It's, as the Dutch says, we gotta get all the cows with the noses all headed in the same direction. So what we did was we said, all right, if we're going to focus on resilience, we want to create the most resilience-focused zoning ordinance in America. It has to be flexible, and there have to be choices in it. It cannot just be a typical rigid, this is what you must do, and get over it. Because there are so many changes that are occurring today in terms of technology, so many changes that are occurring in the way we're thinking about things. It needed to be designed with the flexibility to use all of the things that are coming in the future that we can't even imagine today. And so we created a system of choice-based flexible requirements. Now, there are some things you got to do, but for the most part, we created things that gave people the opportunity to meet those requirements in ways that they get to choose, not necessarily that we get to choose. So at any rate, I'll talk real quickly. I know I'm going on a little longer perhaps than we should, but Eldon said some of these things I need to explain a little bit more. So next slide, please. So in the must category, we have performance standards. And we incorporated, we have a performance-based, form-focused zoning ordinance. And anybody wants to talk about that, I can. But performance-based means that we, every single use in the city, there are performance standards that are applicable to that use. Some are just general performance standards, but there are some that are very specific. And so we built resilience into the performance standards for all of these various uses. So we require freeboard. Basements are prohibited. Then there are several uses that are required to maintain power through power outages using generators or whatever, you know, the technology becomes in the future. And you can see what those are, but it's the idea of you've got to be able to stay in place during the shocks in order to be able to weather the stresses. Now, this is not a suggestion, please do not misinterpret. This is not a suggestion that if a category 5 hurricane is bearing down and there is a evacuation order, that you should be able to shelter in place because you have a generator. That is not what we're saying. But what we are saying is that when the summer rain bomb comes and with the thunderstorm and knocks out power for 12 hours to a portion of the city, you know, this is critical infrastructure for maintaining the health and safety and economy of our city. And so we need to be able to keep these things open. You know, and you know, when a hurricane comes, we lose power for a week, you know, then the ability for people to be close to their property is a real, you know, assuming the property is habitable and safe, it increases community safety because there are, you know, eyes on the street and people there and what have you. And so to facilitate that, things need to be, you know, people need to be able to get their prescription drugs. They need to be able to get ice to keep things cooled and chilled. You know, you got to be able to get to an ATM machine because often credit cards aren't working. You know, and so it becomes a cash-based transaction throughout the city. So those are all the reasons why we have that. And we can talk more about that if anybody's interested. Next slide, please. No, as I said, we are a performance-based, form-focused. So, you know, form-based codes, people know those are the ones with the transects and what have you. That is not what we have here. What we created were form standards that are applicable to certain portions of the city because there is a predominant form that is there and has been there. Norfolk is a 400-year-old city, and these neighborhoods. One of the things that we know from the literature is protecting the character of neighborhoods keeps neighborhoods stronger. When neighborhoods, you know, when the teardowns and the rebuilds just don't fit the pattern, then that's when neighborhoods starting to decline. And so what we're trying to do is use form standards to make sure that neighborhoods, the forms that are already there are generally replicated. But it also is such things as making sure that we have front porches. front porches are eyes on the street. It is essential for public safety. Um, and this is also where we get into the idea of how do you elevate structures so that the freeboard that we require, which is somewhere between 18 and 24 inches, and except in floodplain areas where it may be higher, how does that get integrated into the form of both homes and businesses? Next slide, please. All right, and we reinforce all this through pattern books. So some of these are is guidance, and some of it is how do you, or some of them are actually plans that we have for some of our more fragile neighborhoods. We create the plans and make them available to builders to encourage building in some of those fragile neighborhoods. The builders, they really like the idea of free plans and free building permits. They don't necessarily like the idea of actually having to follow the plans, which has been a bit of a challenge to us, because what we've done in some of these plans is we focus on the total cost of ownership as opposed to the cost of acquisition. And builders, of course, do not like to listen to people when we tell them that if you invest more in the building, it actually will be a better building for the subsequent owner, because they're not interested in the subsequent owner. They're only interested in building something, selling it for whatever the max markup is they can make, and moving on. They want to pass along all the risk and all the responsibility to the owner, and incur none of that for themselves. So the idea that we have designed plans that have 6-foot stud wall systems, exterior stud wall systems, so that they can be much more heavily insulated. They like the free plans, they like the free building permits. They would like to be able to not have to do those kinds of things that we have in the plans. But that's part of the trade-off that we've got there. Next slide, please. All right, then we have the resilience overlays. And this is where we start getting into the really flexible stuff. So, but first is the coastal resilience overlay. And it really, it's that area that you see in gold on the map. It's the very same map I showed you earlier in the presentation of the places where we're going to have increased nuisance flooding as a result of 2 to 3 meters of sea level rise. And so what we do there is we require higher first floor elevations. We require more landscaping, more open space, essentially creating more sponge area to soak in water. And then we try to limit the use of impervious surfaces to the extent we possibly can. So that's, we really, and that's when you start seeing the resilience quotient in a moment, this is the area to which that really applies heavily. The upland area are those areas that are largely, remember the map where I showed you the green? These are largely the green and some of the purple areas, where, in essence, what we have done is said, all right, these areas are pretty good. You still have to consider resilience, but the standards, the number of points you have to get or the standards you have to achieve are somewhat less. And we've also created a system where you can transfer resilience points from the coastal resilience overlay to the upland resilience overlay. It's not a transfer of development rights, but it's a transfer of resilience points by creating easements or removing at-risk structures from the coastal resilience overlay. Next slide, please. And then we have a neighborhood resilience overlay, which is not really related to the, has very little to do with the idea of the floodplain. But what this is it gets back to that form component that I was talking about, where neighborhoods have particular, have developed over time a particular character by having similar forms. and we allow neighborhoods to come in and ask for a neighborhood resilience overlay, so to either add additional form and development standards, or to back off from some of the basic form and development standards that are written in as default in the ordinance. And so each neighborhood has the opportunity to tailor the form and development standards for that particular neighborhood. It's a time-consuming process, and we're glad that only a relatively few neighborhoods have chosen to take us up on this, but in the ones that have, I think are very pleased with the results. Next slide. All right, I warned you about the resilience quotient, and this is where we built in lots of flexibility. And it says it's a point-based system, and you've got all kinds of ways to make points. And the property owner and the developer get to pick which tactics they use for each particular project. And you may have similar projects that for whatever reason choose different tactics, and so that's fine. So next slide. So the construct of the resilience quotient, and the slide is in here because the way we apply the resilience quotient in Norfolk works for Norfolk, but the basic construct is something that can work for many localities that are facing different challenges than we are. So it's essentially pick your geography and what risk you're trying to mitigate, and then develop a laundry list of the tactics for each of these mitigation strategies, assign points, and create some point requirements. I want to tell you, we didn't get it right the first time in Norfolk. We still don't have it calibrated the way we want. We just got a Sea Grant fellow to help us go back and really recalibrate even more than we already have. So next slide. I like flowcharts. I'm a big fan of them. Some of my staff hate them, but so the idea is that you've got some baseline resilience standards, and then you have the resilience quotient. And in the middle, in the orange, are the bonus, which I talked about, where you can essentially take points from the coastal and move them to the upland by doing things that really mitigate risk in the coastal. So the three things that we do in Norfolk as part of our resilience quotient are stormwater management, and that mostly is treating the raindrop as close to where it falls as possible. Traditional engineering in cities is always to have the raindrops fall on a impervious surface, and where they can flow into a channel, and then the channel can convey the water to a pipe, which then conveys the water to someplace where it goes away. Problem we have in Norfolk is that we have a stormwater system that was designed in many years ago, and it's entirely inadequate today for lots of reasons. Number one, the base storm is more intense and drops more rainfall than what the system was designed for. Two, we have this problem of sea level rise, which means that the end of the pipe is too often underwater. And if the end of the pipe is underwater, that means there's no water going to flow out of that pipe. It's just going to store water until it can't store anymore, and then it just bubbles up and overflows. So stormwater management is a huge issue for us. And it's one of those areas where we have a lot of flooding in places that FEMA doesn't recognize as part of the floodplain. And that's why we are now focused heavily on stormwater management and storing the first inch and a quarter on site from every storm. The risk reduction, mostly that is that's building code things that you choose using, high impact resistant glazing, and choosing to build using a fully connected path from your roof all the way down to your foundations. It's also elevation. As I said, we do not allow we essentially have prohibited slab on grade residential construction in the city, and we've prohibited basements. So that's that's one of those things that we have put in to reduce risk, because as we keep talking about this, I keep using the basketball scenario, that it takes one kid's basketball to go away to block a storm drain to cause an entire street to flood. And that's that's the kind of thing that we deal with all the time. And then finally, we talk about energy self-reliance. Alternative energy is one of the things that can be used, solar, wind, but at the very least, it's being generator ready. Getting back to that whole thing about not just being able to shelter in place, but be able to return as quickly as possible, even before the power is back on, to protect your property and to contribute to the economy and life of our city. So that's what this is all about. Next slide. So our quotient requirements, we've put in lots of different options. You can see them here, but it's some of these are essentially, these are requirements until you get, and if you want to use the optional point table, you can. Next slide. So here's a point table. I'm not going to go over it. You're not intended to be able to actually read it, but it just gives you the idea that there are the three components. You've got to earn points in each of those components, and that's all based on the size or intensity of what you're building. A 5-unit apartment building has much less than a 55-unit apartment building type of thing, and or industrial, it's based on square footage, and commercial, same way. So the more you're building, the more points you have to get. It's pretty simple that way. Next slide. And then here's just, again, not intended to really be able to read it, but all of this is now comes through the site plan process, whether it's the abbreviated site plan process for single family detached, or the full-blown site plan for that goes through for commercial stuff. All right, I see somebody has 3 questions. Do we want to stop and talk about them now, or do you want me to run through the rest and then come back?
Just keep going. I'm just going to give you the questions for when you finish.
Okay, all right. I've only got just a little bit more, and then we can get to it. All right, next slide. All right, and then this is just an example of a single family. Typically, we essentially put in there putting in rain barrels to capture 200 gallons of rain, that sufficient number of rain barrels. Mostly they're 55 gallons, so that's 4 rain barrels. And we've just recently, and I've got a slide, we just recently, I think, improved our ordinance to allow people to start using trees for the stormwater uptake, because the trees are a little bit more long lasting, and you don't have to worry about winterizing them quite the way you have to winterize rain barrels. But those are the 3 things that you got to do for a single family at minimum. Next slide. And I mentioned we just did a tree protection, preservation, and planting requirement. It becomes effective on the 1st of January of next year. But we're using the tree canopy authorization that we get from the Code of Virginia. What we find, though, Norfolk is, again, it's 400-year-old city. A lot of the lots are much, much smaller than what you typically find in many Virginia communities. And on the really small lots, it's very difficult to get to the tree canopy that's allowed in the Code of Virginia. So we actually put in a sliding scale so that our 2,000 square foot lots don't have to get the full 20% tree canopy, and we scale it up a little bit. So that's one of the things that we did. But this is one of those things where preservation of trees on a site, you can start getting credit for your stormwater management, because trees do a tremendous job of stormwater uptake in a natural sense. Next slide. So lessons learned. Community vision is vital, and we did. That was probably Vision 2100 was the other than elections, the most public participation in a city project that we had ever had, because it was we went to every nook and cranny and tried to get folks to participate. We brought food trucks in and gave people free coupons for food trucks so that they would come and grab something to eat and talk to us about the vision and that sort of thing. Visions are great, but implementation is can be problematic. And the idea, though, is to use every single tool that you can. I'm sure all of you have heard the expression that if the only tool in your toolbox is a hammer, all of your problems look like nails. So we have tried to avoid that by putting as many tools in our toolbox as we possibly can, so that we can be flexible in how we approach things. Sometimes I think we've been a little too flexible, but it's probably erring on the right side of things. What we determined through Vision 2100 and all of our conversations is that people in Norfolk, because of their experience of the nuisance flooding, they really, what's causing sea level rise, what's causing climate change, that's an interesting intellectual question to ask and discuss, but they want their city to darn well do something about the effects that are occurring in the city. And so that's why we've not had any problem whatsoever dealing with creating enhanced floodplain standards. By the way, we are a CRS Category 5 community. For those of you who know what that means, we've not had any issues with this whole resilience focus. And in fact, the folks have voted themselves a tax increase to put aside money for resilience and flood control projects. So I think that's my last slide. So now it's time for all those questions. Why don't you kill the slides, Eldon, so we can get back to the Hollywood squares and
off of mute. And I think let's try to take them in the order of folks who signed up there in the chat. John from Northern Neck, you had a question.
Yeah, George, some of the approaches that the city's taking are very interesting. Some of the incentives that you're creating for development are what I would consider unique. But I'd like to learn more about that particular carrot, reducing permit requirements in exchange for conservation easements. Could you explain a little bit how that works?
Yeah, I wish I could. It's one of those things. We wrote this. We wrote it in. I wrote it into the ordinance. My staff all thought that I had been drinking too much or smoking too much or something too much. But I wrote it in knowing that we were going to have to create a way to actually effectuate it. And we've not really gotten there yet. We essentially hired Wetlands Watch and Skip Stiles who went out and got a grant to try to help us figure out how to best incentivize that. My basic concept was that, piggybacking the idea of the tax credits that you get from both the state and the feds for putting conservation easements onto to property. And then if we could create a market value for resilience points that somebody would want to pay in addition to the tax credits, we could get people pretty close to being whole. And so that's the basic concept, but we just have yet to figure out how to make it work. One of the problems that we had, and we're soon going to have this one solved. One of the problems we had is that an easement has to be held by if it's essentially the land's donated to the city with an easement over top of it, the city can probably be the easement holder, but in most cases the easement has to be held by a certified conservation entity, and most of those land trusts were not set up to take easements that are potentially as small as the ones that we're talking about. And every one of them requires going out and taking a look at it once a year and making sure that there's an overhead requirement for that. And so we are working our way through it. I think we are going to have, I'm thinking by March of 22, we're going to have something that we're ready to roll out and put on the books. The ultimate use of the land we don't use the term as frequently perhaps as some people would like us to, but it's part of managed retreat. It's the ultimate use of the land is that it's going to become underwater or so impacted by water that it's not going to be usable as in a land sense. And so what we're really doing is thinking that this is, ultimately future wetlands, future coastal marsh, and hopefully making sure that we're preparing land so that the environmental values that we all know are associated with coastal marsh and wetlands are preserved as the water starts moving inland. Did that answer the question?
Very good. Thank you. We'll keep an eye on how that shakes out. Thank you very much.
Yeah, and trust me, if you got any bright ideas, we're all ears. I mean, I always joke and say, the first art of planning is plagiarism. So, feel free to steal anything you want from our ordinance, but also understand that we'd love to be able to steal back the great ideas that you come up with so that we all get better as a result.
Thank you. Thank you.
Luke, I think you next had a question.
Yeah, I did. I was just wondering if there were any incentives for going above and beyond the minimum requirements for freeboard or building standards or form standards. And then I also had a follow-on question, if you'll allow. You'll have to excuse my naivete for this one, but what portion of the city of Norfolk does the Navy base consider sort of mission critical? And is there a way to leverage the relationship with them to get more conservation easements? Like just have them do the land buyouts.
All right, well, let me get back to the incentives. No, there are no incentives built in to the ordinance for going above and beyond. However, with respect to building code requirements and extra elevation and things like that, there is an incentive built into the National Flood Insurance program, and with the new risk rating 2.0, even more so, that it will reduce your annual insurance premiums by going above and beyond. So that's one thing from that perspective. But for going above and beyond, form standards, probably not. Going above and beyond with insulation, yeah, it reduces the total cost of ownership. Although builders don't understand that, but the people who actually then live in those houses very much understand that. So, naval base, they pretty much consider their entire Navy base to be critical. Even though there's a lot of open space, as it were, on the Navy base, that open space ends up getting covered with cars when they send out carrier battle groups. It's where the sailors park their cars to get onto the carrier battle groups. When a carrier battle group leaves Norfolk, that's 16 to 17,000 personnel that are leaving. Now, not all of them are stationed in Norfolk. Some of them are down in North Carolina at the air base, and somewhere in Virginia Beach at Oceana and what have you. But it is a huge number of people that we are moving out to sea, and many of them end up. That's where they park their vehicles. Obviously, people who are married or have partners or whatever, they can get dropped off and don't need to have a place to park the car. But for many of the sailors, that's where they do. So the Navy base considers their entire operation to be critical, but the Navy base has got a bunch of it that is very much at risk from sea level rise. In most of the, for all of the carrier piers, it used to be classified, but it's no longer classified. For all the carrier piers, they've added a third level because the original lower level is no longer usable. And these are, I remember when we early on in this process, when we were doing one of the first scoping meetings on Vision 2100, I was talking to an admiral who said, when I first heard sea level rise, my thought was, I don't know what the problem is. More water under the keel, what's not to like? And then he said, then all of a sudden I realized, well, I got to park these things, at a pier at some point, and there's where the problem lies. And so, that's what I think. Trying to get the Navy though to help with open space. I'm not sure that I'm not sure I've got the silver tongue to be able to convince them to do that yet.
Well, thanks for humoring that question.
I'm sorry. Pat, I think you're next.
Thanks. Yeah, thought it might be helpful just to put the essence of my three questions in the chat box. But the first one, George, is, and thanks for all this. It's extremely helpful. What's the basis of your science? And is that an issue? Like to say, oh, it's not sea level rise, it's not going to go that high. We don't have to worry. Where do you get your science, and how do you sell it?
Well, okay. First of all, where do we get the science? The science comes from the Commonwealth has created a coastal. Help me, Eldon, with the name of it. It's a consortium of Old Dominion University, William and Mary Law School, the Virginia Institute of Marine Science. I think UVA's got some piece of it. I'm not sure what that is, but so it's a
Coastal Policy Center.
Yeah, there we go. And that's where we get the science, and the science part of that really comes from VIMS. And early on in my presentation, I showed you the slide that had the four exponential lines that are the range. And then, you know, for whatever reason, everybody has glommed onto the intermediate high curve, and that's what we're all planning for. That's what we're designing to. You know, even, you know, now with the Biden administration, the federal government is back on board with having to design to that intermediate high curve. So I mean, it's a, you know, we're just using the same curve, but we started using that curve before everybody else. We just happened to be lucky and pick right. And Hampton Roads, the Hampton Roads Planning District Commission, all the communities voted unanimously to adopt that intermediate high curve as the design, the sea level rise design curve to be used throughout Hampton Roads. So again, we don't have to convince people that this is real because they experience it all the time. And I get the fact that out in you know, ruby red Southwest Virginia, you know, they don't see it, they don't feel it, and it doesn't impact them, and so they may, you know, and for whatever reasons they have, you know, they may say, well, it's maybe we don't believe that science. And partly because, you know, we all believe most what we can see and experience ourselves. And if we can't see it and experience it, well, then it's harder to believe. But I don't have that problem because we get to see it and experience it. It's simple little things. It's places where even as recently as 3 and 4 years ago, places where grass was growing. But now it no longer grows because the tide inundates it, and of course it's all brackish water, so it's salt water. You know, the tide inundates it so frequently that grass no longer can grow there. I mean, and people see that stuff, and it's happening in greater areas across the city. I don't have a problem convincing people of the need to do this. In fact, most people, their answer is A, maybe shouldn't we do more? Or B, what took you so long?
Great, thanks. The second one, as you mentioned that people in Norfolk don't care, use the word climate change, they just want their problems fixed. But it's related to how the state positions itself for supporting resiliency and adaptation. There's a state action plan that was formulated in 2008, I think started by Governor Keene, but it's kind of sat there ever since, and states not been out front and talking about climate change. Is that a problem for you? Is there state support that could be better, or if there was become more statewide, you know, support for the impact that's coming?
Well, I mean, we always, you know, look favorably on state support and federal support. You know, it's one of those things where, you know, basic economic principle, more is preferred to less. But I think we're okay with a lack of support as long as we're continuing to get benign neglect. You know, our neighbor to the south, North Carolina, you know, their state legislature essentially went on the warpath against any kind of resilience planning and resilience work. And that you know, so the fact the state isn't necessarily out there championing it and cheerleading it is less of I can live with that as long as they're not actively trying to sabotage what the work we're trying to do. And you know, I would be less than honest if I didn't say we are worried about what this incoming administration might do, given some of the words that have been spoken by some of the people that are close to the incoming administration. Was that a sufficient non-answer to your question?
Yeah, no, that's very helpful, actually. I think it paints a picture. The last one is, which is kind of related to that. So everyone always wrings their hands about the cost of dealing with resiliency and adaptation. And does your planning kind of bring in over, you have a 100-year plan, how does it bring in the cost of implementing that 100-year plan?
Well, I guess we start with the premise that the cost of doing nothing is pretty substantial too. The vision envisions, as I said, a whole of government, whole of community approach. And the city cannot pay for all of the infrastructure that will be needed. Just simply can't do it. And it's no surprise to anybody on this call, this as a nation, we're somewhere between 20 and 35 years behind in infrastructure planning and development across the country, everywhere. We have we just got approved a couple of years. It's been a couple of years ago, pre-pandemic, a coastal storm surge barrier plan from the Corps of Engineers, and I'll tell you, the Corps is busy designing it, busy enough that we're beginning to get a little concerned at some of what they're designing and where they want to put it. But the very first thing we're doing is we're improving the downtown flood wall, because the downtown flood wall with sea level rise no longer passes the certification requirements for being a flood wall that counts as protecting property from storm surge flooding.
Okay, I think, let's see, Brent, I think you had a.
Thanks, George.
No, I just wanted to point out that there is a coastal resilience master plan, and I believe you will see an administration bill that will seek to make that statewide in this coming General Assembly. As well as I guess I don't harbor those reservations. I believe we're still going to make a lot of progress on resilience in this coming year. I know for you all in Norfolk, it's far behind, and that the flood protection fund is not nearly enough money. I just for everyone on the call to know that there are actions being taken, and there is, as George, I'm sure you are aware, there is conversation about a Commonwealth Flood Board being put forth by Hampton Roads PDC. I know that's kind of still in its preemptive stages. No bill exists, but those conversations are going on as well in a lot of circles. So there are things swirling about in that realm as well.
No, I appreciate that. I always worry, and maybe needlessly so, but I always worry when sometimes ideology trumps pragmatism. We get to witness that pretty much every single day in DC, so anytime there's a change, it's always a concern, whether it's I appreciate that, and I hope you're absolutely right. I hope things are going to continue to move forward.
Corey, I think you have a question.
Yeah, I did, and I came on late, so it's possible I missed some of it, but it was really interesting. I love the idea of having kind of prepackaged home plans that are available. And one of the things that I heard was that the builders love having kind of the ready-made plans with kind of the resiliency features in them, but they don't like paying for those. And what pops in my head is that they probably don't like paying for those because it's hard to get paid from the consumers for those things, because like the 6-inch stud walls, like you can't see that, and actually reduces the livable space, right? So there has to be some explanation and some understanding from the community of the benefits that are built into those resiliency plans. So I was curious if you guys leave that to the builders to promote those resiliency features into the community, or if the city's actually doing anything to make those features that are in those plans desirable and desired by the community.
Yeah, so great question. And if you want to see the one that's probably the most successful, and you go to our website, you look up the Huntersville homes plan book. That's the one that's been the most successful. So how does, we worked with the community. We worked with the Civic League and and all the various homeowners and property owners in this particular neighborhood to develop this plan book. And so the community leaders are the biggest cheerleaders for the project, which is part of the reason for its success. But to be blunt, these are intended to be affordable single family ownership opportunities. And so, for us, keeping the total cost of ownership as low as we possibly could, while keeping the maintenance requirements as minimal as possible in order to ensure that the properties are kept up, or at least have the street, the curb appeal remains relatively constant. So these are houses that now pre-pandemic, things are a little insane right now, but pre-pandemic, the material cost to build one was sitting at about 68 to 70,000. And there's some additional some additional things that aren't included in that, but with the material cost and sitting at that, and for the most part, city giving away the land, the plans, and the permitting, builders are able to sell something at in the 190 to 210 range. So they're able to pocket a reasonable profit. And we actually do, with great intentionality, we have reached out and tried to work with minority builders, particularly Black builders, to build capacity. I mean, that's part of what we were trying to do. I think, for those who were on at the very beginning, I said, what we don't ever try to do things with a single bullet. We try to have multiple benefits to everything we do. So part of this was also to build capacity in the minority contractor community to be able to build and successfully compete for projects and whatever in the city. So there's a lot of stuff in all that. It's just sometimes greed trumps things, and then of course in the post-pandemic, when the cost of a 2x4 got as high as $12. I really understand people trying to cut corners, because cost of a 2x4 got to $12, but the real estate market was absolutely insane. You drop a load of 2x4s on a piece of property and you have the house sold before you even started framing it up. It was a strange times. And I'm glad that I'm very glad that I am not making my money by being a builder, because that right now is I think a very tough business to be in. So did I successfully not answer your question, Corey?
No, that one you actually answered, I think, pretty good.
Oh, okay, all right. I mean, I'm trying to prove that I'm a planner. I can talk at great length and never actually seen it.
All right. Other questions? I think we got everything that was in the chat. Okay, with that, George, thank you very much.
Yeah, you're welcome.
It's well, share one more thing with us. What do you see as the next big step for Norfolk's effort on this?
Well, I think our next big step is going to have to focus on. I think we're going to have to try to figure out the diversity, inclusion, and equity component, because I'm not sure we've done that well. And you know, I mentioned the Corps of Engineers and their coastal surge protection study, and unfortunately, the Corps of Engineers uses a benefit cost analysis that there's no other way to say it, but it makes the properties owned by rich white folks much more valuable than the properties owned by poor black folks. And so it means that they're willing to spend money to protect the properties of the rich white folks, but they're not willing to spend federal dollars to protect the other properties. That's a problem. That's a huge problem in a city. You know, as I mentioned earlier, you know, we have nearly 50% of our families that in Norfolk that live below the poverty line. You know, we have a lot of black property owners, but their properties are on average valued somewhere about, I think the number is somewhere, I think around 37%. The total property valuation of black owned property is 37% of the valuation of white owned property. I'm talking about residential property. You know, these are problems. You know, our community is 50-50. I mean, we are half black, half white. Actually, in our last census, we're about, for lack of a better term, we're about 1/3 white, 1/3 black, and 1/3 mixed race, which is kind of you know, interesting. So it's creating all kinds of problems with us in trying to redistrict, because we're still a community that's under court order to have minority majority districts, and we can't do that with using just the black population. We have to start diving into the mixed race, but we're going to have to get permission from the courts to do that. So that's, you know, one of those interesting challenges that we're dealing with. Richmond's probably dealing with the same thing, because I think their ward system is set up in a way that it has to guarantee a certain number of minority members of city council. So I don't, you know, that's probably where we're going to head. We are, you know, there will be a downtown flood wall expansion and height increase. That's going to happen within, I mean, that work is going to start happening within 5 years. So that's going to be a big thing. We've done this for anybody who get a chance to get down to Norfolk. Please come see our Ohio Creek project, which is a resilience project that we got a grant from as part of the National Disaster Resiliency Competition that in the waning days of the Obama administration. And so we're almost done with it. But we've taken a historically black community with a very high home ownership rate, and built in all kinds of resilience features. But as part of our idea of co-benefits of everything, those resilience features are also recreation features. They're also you know, education features. So we add, you know, try to make all of these things work together. And it also includes a piece of public housing. Not too many public housing projects on the waterfront in America, but this is one that is. And so, you know, it's come see it. It's an amazing thing that we are doing and transforming.
Again, George, thank you very much. And for everybody on here, we're going to wrap this up, and this really wraps up the technical committee's work for 2021. You have in your agendas our meeting schedule for next year, both the technical committee and the commission. So mark them down. I suspect we will continue the technical committee in this virtual format. Today being the exception. This past year, we've had more participation in this committee than probably certainly any time in the last decade. And I think that's been facilitated by the virtual nature of it. It's allowed people from the more distant ends of the basin to participate more regularly than when we meet in Fredericksburg with just the call-in option. So unless I get some major pushback, I think we'll probably keep the technical committee in this format. The commission can't do that. It's a public body, but the commission will be considering some rules changes at the meeting coming up in December that reflect new state statute relative to public meetings. We still will have to have quorum physically present, but we'll have greater flexibility with virtual participation for those who can. But if we're going to conduct business, the state law requires, as long as we're not in a governor declared emergency, state law requires that the quorum be physically present in the room. But with that, unless anybody has any other comments or questions or things they want to say to George, I'll pause.
Eldon, I do have one question. I know on the website it says one of the TAC meetings is March 30th, I believe, and one of the full body meetings is March 23rd. I just had a question about that because usually, you try and meet the week before. I noticed that yesterday.
Yeah, and we had to do that because if we go the week before March 23rd, the General Assembly is going to still be in session, and we found in past years when we do that, that just is a train wreck. So what will happen is if we have some technical committee stuff, there needs to be some communication. We may be doing some stuff by email, but I don't expect so. That first meeting will be the organizing meeting for the year. And so the front part of that meeting gets taken up with those activities. There are certain code required things we have to do at that meeting that we don't do in the other three. And the chairman would like us, since we're going to be in Fredericksburg, if you'll remember the first meeting of this year, we talked about a lot of the projects in the Middle Basin, including several projects right there in Fredericksburg. The chairman would like us, and we're working with the city, to meet in close proximity to the work that has been done on the Riverfront Park. And so we will maybe shorten our meeting, kind of like what we did in Warsaw, and take a little tour, provided the weather cooperates. So I don't know that we need a technical committee in advance of that meeting so much because of what the chairman wants to accomplish that day. So with that, thank you, everybody. Have a great holiday season, and hope everybody, when we get together in March, everybody will have survived the 2022 session of Virginia General Assembly. On that, thanks again, George.
Thanks, George.
Yep, thank you all.
George.
Thanks, George, and Eldon, thanks for a great year.
May I assume, Eldon, that because I was the agenda item, that was the reason that you had such a poor attendance?
No, you can't assume that. That happened because we normally meet on Wednesday, and I had to move it to Thursday because of legislative meetings that overran my calendar for yesterday. So I did this, and this actually conflicts with a Rappahannock Regional Commission meeting that started at 10. And we lost some folks because of that, but I promised people that I'd record it. Of course, I didn't start the recording when you first started. That's why you lost the screen for a second when I went, oh, nuts. I got to start the recording. So anyway, Long answer. Hey, I'm just doing a planner thing. I'm giving you a long answer.
Right.
That's the same thing.
That's right. Absolutely. It's
I
we're
thought
good
this
at
was
it.
great, George. Thank you.
Yeah,
All
man.
right. Thanks, everyone. It goes without saying. I mean, Eldon's going to send out the PowerPoint to you. At the end of it, it's got all of my contact information. Don't hesitate to reach out to me. I do generally better with emails than I do with phone calls, but I will. Either one will be fine.
Yep. And I will get that email out.
All right.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks.
Take care.